witness will be the district attorney. Good afternoon. Please proceed with your testimony.
Good afternoon, Council President. It's always a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to speak to members of Council. We have submitted testimony in order to be able to get to questions a little bit more quickly. I'm going to go off those comments and just say a few things. There are various materials that we want to present in terms of slides that I think are indicative of the direction we are trying to go and our budgetary needs. So I will try to incorporate them into answers to questions. But I do want to say, off of those remarks, a couple of things that I think are very important for us to understand. And those are commentary about where we are historically, where this state is, where this city is. There is a very important study that's going to be released by Columbia University later this week on the subject of probation and parole. It is my understanding that it is not only authoritative and correct, but it is going to name Pennsylvania as being, if not the absolute worst, then one of the 2 or 3 worst in the United States for excessive probation and parole, which would not be such a big deal if it weren't for the fact that excessive probation and parole does a lot of harm. It takes people who have effectively been rehabilitated and put so many hurdles in front of them they almost cannot help but trip. That is something that I think some people in the system may know. Even after 30 years in the criminal courts, it's something that I did not realize because, frankly, I became accustomed to what is normal in Pennsylvania, normal in Philadelphia. Well, let's talk about what else has been normal in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. It has been normal in Pennsylvania to have the second largest number of people doing life without parole sentences in the United States, only behind Florida. It has become normal to have as many people doing life without parole in Pennsylvania as 25 other states combined. It was normal for Pennsylvania to have the largest number of juveniles doing life without parole in the United States, which was also the largest number of people in the world. That has become normal, and it's a big part of my daily job because our committee of highly qualified people has to consider what we're offering on resentencings. Over and over and over, we are finding that what this state and this city has considered normal is not normal. It is not normal, and it causes tremendous damage to our economy. It causes tremendous damage to the relationships between police and the communities that they are there to serve. It causes tremendous damage in almost every way you can imagine to the city of Philadelphia, including its public schools, including its capacity for treating addiction. And that is part of the reason that there has been a movement, and that movement has made its way into the district attorney's office, because that movement, which is very broad-based and very diverse, recognizes that this district attorney's office needs to go a different direction. Now, fortunately, we are blessed in many ways by having, in the midst of this situation, where Philadelphia has no longer has, but had the highest rate of incarceration of the 10 largest cities, this situation where the state has a 700% increase in incarceration, while the United States, an international embarrassment, has a 500% increase. In the midst of this, we have found that in Philadelphia there is a political will, and that there is a team of leaders who are interested in going a different direction. It's curious because you have such a deep problem, reminiscent of Mississippi and Alabama in the 1960s in many ways, and yet you have the political will here to fix it, which is not what you had in Mississippi and Alabama in the 1960s. I mean, in some ways, it's a very, very hopeful situation. We look at Texas as an example of tremendous criminal justice reform in the last several years. But that has a lot to do with 2 things: how bad it was, and the fact that there is forming in Texas a political will. Well, there's a greater political will here, and I am extremely grateful to have to view myself as being the newest partner or the newest team member of a team that includes the members of this council, that includes the mayor, that includes the police commissioner, that includes people from the MacArthur Foundation, includes so many other people who are trying to push in the right direction. So what is that direction? Well, let's talk about 115 days in or so about one of the things that I would view as an early win for this team. And I do mean it's a team. Can we go to slides 7 and 8, please? At the time when we came in, there had been tremendous progress on the MacArthur goal to reduce incarceration in the city of Philadelphia by about 33%. Some very smart people who were doing work in the office as ADAs and had an interest in policy spent a little bit of time, since we know we cannot change state law to make it illegal for there to be cash bail at this time. The political will is not there in Donald Trump's Pennsylvania. We spent a little bit of time trying to find a category of offenses that were not so serious that they really required people to be in custody, but were the offenses that were trapping poor people in jail. And what we ultimately found was approximately 25 offenses that were not violent, that were not sexual assault offenses, where it appeared that middle class and upper class people would get out on bail, but people who were broke would not. And I say that because these were offenses where people were sitting in jail on a bail of $10,000, meaning they only had to pay $1,000 to get out. Once we identified those offenses, we came up with a policy in the middle of February, and then we looked at what happened from the time we came into office in January through when that bail policy was passed, and then we looked at what happened after. And simply put, what happened before was there was a daily reduction in the population in the county jails of about 6 people. And after that, in the same period of time, there was a daily reduction of about 12 people. Now, some of this was due to our bail policy, and some of it was also due to another policy that was announced around the same time around sentencing, a policy that recognized that the Pennsylvania state sentencing guidelines are the problem. They are the problem. They are the reason Pennsylvania is outstripping these other states by having a 700% increase in incarceration rather than 500%. They are not passed by Philadelphia leaders. They are passed by leaders upstate, many of whom are not lawyers, many of whom have never worked in criminal justice, but all of whom have lost their coal mines, and they've lost their industry, and they've come up with another industry. And that industry, sadly, is often to incarcerate people from Philadelphia, thereby obtaining funding that will keep open their schools, that will keep open their bars, that will keep open their diners, and that will keep their residents employed, but also simultaneously, because people incarcerated in those facilities are counted for census purposes in the county, not where they come from, but in the county where they are incarcerated, this became an engine for increasing political power through gerrymandering, by pretending Philadelphians lived in their states when they couldn't vote in their jails, and it became a formula for increasing highway funding by pretending that Philadelphians who resided in their jails and could not drive a car were their residents, thereby driving it up. This is a witch's brew of politics, of racism, and of efforts of counties that are industrially and economically declining to find a way to better their situation at the expense at every single level of the future of the city of Philadelphia. So our policy was, these sentencing guidelines are too high for nonviolent offenses, for offenses that are not sexual assault offenses. You are to give offers that are below the bottom end of the guidelines because they've caused the problem. That policy, plus the bail policy, resulted in what we see here. What we see before are the tremendous and successful efforts of every person on this team going back years, of the MacArthur Foundation, the mayor, council, and all the other players in the criminal justice system, including the FJD and the Public Defender's Office. What you see after is what happens when you have a willing partner. And these entities now have a willing partner. The police commissioner has a willing partner that is not going to look the other way when we find unjust, unconstitutional actions taken by police officers in the way prior DAs who worried more about politics than the truth did. There's a willing partner for people who want to reduce incarceration because, as it turns out, contrary to all the criticism that came at the time saying that the city would be on fire and there'd be zombies running the street, as it turns out, that has not happened. May we see slide 8, please. This is a comparison of the actual situation of crime in the city of Philadelphia this year as compared to last. I am not for 1 minute claiming that this district attorney or any other district attorney really controls crime, because that's not true. But what is true and what is scientific is that we find that despite these bail policies, despite these sentencing policies, violent crime is down 10% as compared to last year. We find aggravated assault, for example, if I'm reading that right, it's down 7%. and most importantly, on this particular batch of statistics, homicide's down 23%. Now there is a publicly available website that has homicides down 13%, and I could get into the intricacies of that, but I won't. The bottom line is it's down, and it's down despite policies that said cash bail not necessary for these offenses. It's down despite policies that said you're giving sentences that are too long for a whole variety of offenses. So we see that these policies can coexist with safety, and we see that we can partner together for things that will be successful. All right, I will now keep whatever part of my promise is left, and I will stop to allow questioning, and hopefully I can make some other points through my responses to questions.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And in your newest capacity, welcome to the City Council of Philadelphia budget hearing. I don't know what you've heard, but it's an awesome opportunity to speak directly to the leadership of the legislative branch and, more importantly, to the people, because we are, in fact, on TV. So thank you and welcome. And thank you for the meeting we had the other day. Just want to talk about it was productive. As you know, you may not know the level of specificity that I referenced, but I've either lived or represented 22nd Police District all my life. And consistently, the 22nd Police District is right up at the top in terms of gun violence. And when you look at the overall city, you know, the numbers are down, things have changed, but the simple reality, there are still parts of the city where there, unfortunately, are gunshots every night. I actually met with a group of young people up at the Parkway School, and we talked about gun violence, and they were concerned that the level of interest and show of support for the shootings on a national level got all of this attention in terms of, you know, those individuals, but their position was, well, people are getting shot in my neighborhood every night, and we don't see the level of support and the attention being paid to those kids. So I do have to talk about the other side of the equation, and I want to thank you, first of all, for your presentation. Awesome. A number of my colleagues have done a great job around this, particularly Councilman Jones. I just want to spend because he's had a formalized role in the criminal justice reform. The special committee done an awesome job earlier with CJAB and the whole 9 yards. I see Ms. Bradford in the back, who was actually one of our co-chairs of our special committee. And it is clear, and I'm glad you referenced this whole issue about the quote-unquote, and not here today, but the prison industrial complex, when a lot of the advocates and some of the more aggressive advocates talked about it, and people kind of poo-pooed it. But it is a reality. I agree with you 1,000%. And I remember when there were conversations around the census where people were counting individuals that were shipped from Philadelphia and other municipal urban areas to those prisons, excuse me, and they were being counted in the census, and it meant that those particular counties and townships got more money from the federal government based on the census. And so I agree with you 1,000% on that. It is a problem, and it is a prison industrial complex. So I want to applaud you for outlining that, lining that out. But on the other side, and I hate to use the term but there is a problem with shootings, and there's a certain level of violence in some of these neighborhoods. And just a little recommendation to you, be careful about touting the numbers, because the numbers can change just like that in terms of homicides and other things. And unfortunately, I've seen it happen too often. We were excited about the numbers going down, and then you get 2-3 bad weekends. That can turn around in a heartbeat. So I just want to talk to you real briefly about, you know, and again, we had a conversation. What are we going to do about, if anything at all, in terms of dealing with, you know, this gun violence, dealing with the people who simply don't want to conform with the neighborhood's norm, not the system's norm, but the neighborhood's norm, where people actually want to have a safe community. They want to have a community where they can raise their children, and they want to have an environment where they have an opportunity to have family and sustaining jobs, all of those good things that all of us deserve. Can you kind of talk to me about, you know, what we can possibly do and what we'd like to do? And I know we're limited based on, you know, these ridiculous laws as it relates to the state of Pennsylvania, but we do have to figure something out, man.
Yes, I'd love to, and I appreciate the opportunity to do so.
Thank you.
So, first of all, I mean, within the confines of what's been done traditionally, there is a joint gun violence task force between the Attorney General's office and the Philadelphia District Attorney's office. We have selected new leadership for that group within Philadelphia and, frankly, given them every resource we have. That new leadership came from a very highly regarded homicide attorney who has spent his career dealing with the aftermath of shootings that are not prevented. It is a criminologically informed, statistically informed group working closely with an excellent lead investigator named Pat Mangold, who has both been a Philadelphia police officer, homicide detective, and now is in the employ of the Attorney General. This is a group of people who get it, they get the specifics, and they understand, as do I, that the key to this is to look for the people who are going to use the guns in the wrong way, as opposed to the scattershot of just looking for anybody who's got guns. It is a more focused and a more effective way of trying to go after the problem, and it deals with the problem in terms of Philadelphia's reality, which is that we have a kind of a gang, but it is really more like a cohort of young men who are growing up potentially only 2 blocks from each other and are getting into conflicts that are sometimes related to criminal activity and drug turf, and sometimes nothing more than about disrespect or whose girlfriend is with whom, and they are armed. So we amped that up. We put a lot of resources into it. We knew spring was coming. We tried to get ahead of it, and I am hopeful that within those sort of traditional approaches that we're going to be effective and successful, because I believe we have the right people there and that they are doing the right kinds of things. There are some other things that we are looking at and need to look at, even though it is only 115 days in. And frankly, this group in the DA's office is unafraid to do it because we're not too worried about the NRA or what they think of us or running statewide. That is of no interest. And it makes it a lot easier to do things that frankly should have been done a long time ago. This council passed a 48-hour reporting requirement for lost or stolen guns. The point of that is that straw purchasers sell guns like they're water on the street to criminals. And then whenever those guns are found on the body of someone who's been shot or they're connected to a shooting, those people who bought the gun say, oh yeah, it got stolen, you know, 4 or 5 years ago, I just never reported it. Well, that's nonsense. They sold it, and they bought 7 other guns and they sold them. And those guns just haven't popped up on the bodies of people yet. If there is a requirement that within 48 hours of a gun being lost or stolen, it makes it a little harder to be a straw purchaser. It means that when that gun does pop up later and you didn't report it, you have a problem. Now, the City Council's ordinance has limits, obviously, and it's not as effective as, for example, a federal or statewide law that would put appropriate penalties on it, but it has some effect. It should be used. It should have been used already, and it's something that we are prepared to use moving forward, regardless of the political problems. If you talk to people who have been hard-nosed detectives and police officers in Philadelphia for a long time around violence, they will tell you youth programs. I had one of them say to me specifically, yeah, we're going to go after the hardheads. Of course we're going to do that, but I'm tired of locking up kids. I'm tired of locking up kids. We need to have effective youth programs that give young men, and it is men, something to do other than hang out with the corner boys, have conversations with them, view them as role models. There has to be more to do. And you know, you can see that anywhere from going into a community rec center with basketball floors broken, and the coach of the team who works there for free is periodically trying to fix it himself so the kids can continue to play, or even in the quality of the basketballs that are all worn out and barely usable anymore. We have to have youth programs, whether they are athletic or arts, whether they are things that are additional educational instruction, whatever it may be, that gives some kind of an alternative to that. In terms of focused deterrence, we have with us Movita Johnson-Harrell, who is the newly appointed chief of our victim services, and frankly, a force of nature who's done remarkable work for victims already that this city has not seen in the past, and there's more announcements coming. But she also has quite a bit of experience with focused deterrence, having focused on that issue herself after the murder of her son Charles, which followed the murder of 2 other family members in her life. Was personally involved with focused deterrence in a pilot in South Philadelphia. And as with many things, it's the details that matter. But there has been a half-hearted commitment to focused deterrence, which proved successful in a pilot program in South Philadelphia. There was a stick involved, but there should have been a little more carrot. And I think that a properly vetted focused deterrence program, which this office would be delighted to join in offering with police department, other agencies, with the assistance of city council and the mayor. I think that could play a significant role. There are national resources, such as the Prosecutors Against Gun Violence, which is a national organization which was founded by district attorneys in LA and New York, that works with DAs and chiefs of police all over the country. I have been asked to be a member even before I came into office, and I have invited Commissioner Ross to join me. These are major cities all over the country. These are good, smart DAs and good commissioners seeking national solutions and also trying to keep the NRA's national agenda of doing things like making silencers generally available in check. Isn't that a good idea in the middle of a mass shooting spree, to make silencers generally available? Well, that's what your NRA is up to. And if you don't have mayors and chiefs of police stepping up and saying something about it because they're not afraid of the NRA's politics, then you're not going to have any improvement. We have to go after gun shops in a way that it has not occurred previously, and go after gun shows, not the owners who are following all the laws and are following the best practices like those that were given during the Bloomberg administration and then rejected all across the city by gun owners under threat of the NRA. We have to be willing to engage, and if that means that there's going to be some level of surveillance, if that means there's going to be efforts to check carefully and trace back as much as the law permits, then we're going to have to do that. We have to be willing to shake things up a little. And finally, I will make another suggestion here that is not fully vetted, but it's one that's come up in discussions with some of our best experts. There's gun court done right. There's gun court done wrong. We need to look at doing gun court right. And by that I mean, you look at the individual, you look at the case. You're not going to take the college student with no prior record who bought a gun legally at a gun shop because he got beat up and wasn't checking carefully enough to know he needed a permit to carry when he safely carried that gun out of fear. You got to know the difference between that and a gangbanger. And if gun court simply goes after everybody indiscriminately without regard to the truth about whether these are criminals or they are people who in any other county would not be in violation of the law at all, then it will fail. But if gun court is focused on people who are bona fide criminals who are using guns for the wrong purpose, then it can be effective. The city of Philadelphia, and I invite council and I invite all leadership in the city to work on this issue with me, but the city of Philadelphia may, I say may, have a model in what has been done in New Jersey, Chicago, Los Angeles, and other locations, where rather than focusing on restricting individuals' use or access to guns, they focus on the licensing of gun dealers under at least citywide authority. A licensing that can do things like reduce thefts of firearms from gun shops, which is nationally becoming more and more prevalent. A licensing that can provide some pressure on these gun shops not to engage in sloppy practices, not to engage in practices that are unwise from a social perspective. That is something that we are only beginning to explore, but I'd be delighted to work with council. And it is something that may get us around some of the preemption issues that seem to plague so much other legislation, because those preemption issues arguably go to individuals rather than commercial establishments. So we have a lot to do, and we have a lot to do in many different directions. This is an administration that looks forward to working with council and all the other partners and all the agencies, even ATF, which has been told by our president to stand down. We look forward to working with all agencies that actually have an interest in reducing gun violence.
Right. Thank you. Just wanted to give you, thank you, the opportunity of this forum to talk about, in a public way, about some of the things that we discussed during the course of our meeting, so people understand that you are, in fact, interested in focusing on gun violence, because there's this notion out there that that may not be the case. So this is probably the best platform as it relates to doing that. And we obviously will follow up and continue our conversation. I forgot to mention Councilman Johnson, who has actually had a special committee on gun violence that is much broader than simply focusing on the gun, because at the end of the day, there's an underlying issue as to why a young person at some point in their life decides to pick up a gun and go out on the street and stand on the corner and wear that gun as a part of their uniform of the day. And it has to do with, being involved in poverty, family structure, peer pressure, the wrong kind of peer pressure, not having the opportunities, not looking at the end of the tunnel and not seeing a light, but seeing no way out. So we are clearly, particularly being the legislative branch that appropriates dollars, that will in fact get people on a direct path. You can look forward to us being a viable partner in this very, very important issue. So I want to thank you for laying out that particular issue.
Council President, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
You're welcome, sir. Chair recognizes Councilman Greenlee.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Councilman.
Just had one question particularly on the issue of witness services. You talk in your written testimony about services for both victims and witnesses. Is there, because I know there's a lot of problems sometimes with getting cooperation of witnesses. Do you have any thoughts about that issue yet, or specifically on how you can improve that situation?
Councilman, we do. As I mentioned previously, we have a force of nature in our new head of victim services. This is someone who has not only lived the experience of being a victim of homicide with 3 different victims in her family, including her son, but it is someone who has a master's in social work from the University of Pennsylvania and has worked very effectively with a nonprofit she founded called the Charles Foundation. Very well known to and very close to Jennifer Storm, who is the victim advocate for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, a person with whom I have been dealing, but frankly only through the contact that was made, and a person whose budget statewide to deal with these kinds of services is going to explode from about $30 or $40 million to almost $130 or $40 million over the next few years. So needless to say, that is a relationship that can be very important to the city of Philadelphia in terms of assisting witnesses and assisting victims of crime. But more immediately, what we have done is we have determined that while there are some truly excellent advocates within victim services, there were some people who were phoning it in, who frankly, and by phoning it in, what I mean is every time we were trying to be in touch with victims in a case, they'd make a phone call. And if it wasn't answered, then they'd write that down. And then they'd do it again and write that down. Through Movita's efforts, we switched directions when we found out that the contact wasn't being made. We started to use DA's detectives to actually go to houses, bang on doors when it was obvious that either phone numbers had changed or had been given to other people or whatever it may be. And we have had significantly more effectiveness with that. We had to change a few personnel who came from the prior administration who had been doing things that way for some time. And so that has been one of the aspects of it. We have started a Crime Victims Advisory Committee, which has not existed previously. We call it CVAC. Applications have been submitted by members of the community, and their purpose will be to advise us on an ongoing basis on our policies, how we deal with victims, how we deal with witnesses, to try to improve that. We have a significant problem going on in the Criminal Justice Center right now, signaled to me by Movita Johnson-Harrell and also other people within victim services, which is that there has been historically a large room located on one of the floors of the Criminal Justice Center, which was a safe space for witnesses and for victims, and somehow they got pushed out of it. And it started to be used for the purpose of police officers checking in. From what I understand, it really is excessively large for the needs of the police department in that regard, but it was exactly what these victims and witnesses needed previously. So we need to take that back, simply put, and those discussions are ongoing. There need to be some improvements in relocation. It's something that we are working on very actively. As we all know, that historically there have been instances when there was even funding available for relocation that wasn't used by the end of the year. So we're trying to see what we can do in that regard. But I think perhaps most importantly, we need to look at the fundamental issue of what has been done for victims in the past in the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office and what it is that victims need. What has been done in the past is generally understandable, good, but it's limited. It's not the full extent of what we now know, and we know scientifically and we know from experts in the field victims need. What has been done in the past, unfortunately, was a culture that did not look at restorative justice. It did not look at all the needs of the victims. It tended to focus on essentially trying to address the trauma, the suffering, the difficulties that the victims were going through by offering them a bunch of years in jail for the defendant, or saying, okay, we'll seek the death penalty, as opposed to looking more broadly at what they need. And then I guess the question, of course, is what do they need? Well, they need a few things. One of the things that they need often is a coherent explanation for why this occurred. I can tell you as someone who was stabbed myself, and I suffered only slightly compared to so many people we see all the time. You can be shook for a couple years by what happened. You want to know why it happened. I never knew, because the people who did it during a robbery with me were never caught. But you would like to know, was that mental illness? Was that addiction? Was that something else? What happened? Victims want to know that they will be safe when the perpetrator is released from custody, but they also want to know that other people will be safe. Well, that's information. So some of the things they might want to know are, did this person get treatment in custody, and was it effective? Did this person seek treatment? They may want an apology, some level of closure, not a phony one, but a real one. And we have a court system where that's almost not permitted. There are so many walls to a defendant ever really speaking to a victim and addressing that it simply has not been provided. These are things that victims need, and they boil down often to information. They want to know when people are being paroled. They are entitled to know when people are being paroled. And they also want to be protected in their capacity as witnesses and so on. Mm-hmm. So, there are best practices around the country, which frankly have not been always followed in Philadelphia. We're trying to go there. We have tremendous interest, possibly with outside foundational funding, for certain types of restorative justice programs for less serious offenses that have been found to be much more satisfactory to victims in places like Oakland, California, and elsewhere, and also produce lower recidivism among juveniles who have committed crimes as serious as an unoccupied burglary or a robbery with no weapon. These are scientifically vetted. They make victims happier, and as a consequence of that, we are now in the process of starting to have evaluation of the satisfaction of victims with how they are treated through the process. We understand that mistakes have been made in this administration and in prior administrations. We are trying to do better every day, and we're committed, if we have to putting more of our own resources, certainly with the help of City Council in this budget season. We're committed to putting more resources into those efforts, but we are looking at a fundamental shift in trying to address the trauma and all of the other needs that victims have, as opposed to using victims as witnesses where the only thing that they really look forward to is a certain number of years and call that some sort of complete justice. It's part of justice, but it's not a complete justice.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you for that answer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilman. Chair now recognizes Councilman Jones. Chair recognizes Councilman Gim.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Krasner, for your leadership over the past few months. I know that, I'm glad that you spoke to the political will that brought you into office and also brings you into this whole community. I know my council colleagues in particular, our city departments, community members, organizers have been committed to criminal justice reform for years, and I'm confident that you're going to help us move that forward in significant ways. In particular, I wanted to thank you for your memo to the ADAs and the guidance around plea deals, sentencing, and supervision. I think that has been an important aspect. Obviously, we're not going to be able to erase the history of over-policing and mass incarceration, but we can recognize that these policies have gone on too long and that communities, especially Black, brown communities, have paid too high of a price for it. And I look forward to partnering with you as we meet, these goals of reforming the system. But, as we keep talking, I'd like to focus most of my time on the ways that victims will be incorporated in your work. I think you spoke to that to a certain measure for the Crime Victims Advisory Board. And how do you see that board interfacing with the district attorney's office, in-house victim service agencies already, as well as the community-based victims and witness services agencies? And do you already have the members selected for this board?
My understanding is that we are collecting applications and they have not been determined yet. As you know, we announced this probably about a month ago or so, but we're hoping to do that soon. I mean, honestly, I see the CVAC as being a resource that provides us with an ongoing listening session on how we can do things better and what is not going well and what is going well. I don't pretend to stand in the shoes of someone who has lost a child to gun violence or who has suffered a sexual assault. I would never pretend to stand in those shoes, but my feeling is that by getting a diverse bunch of people with different experiences in the community, that we will constantly be in a position to evaluate ourselves and try to do better with that. We have met with a lot of the outside and, internally connected groups that are working to advocate for victims. We take their input very seriously, just as we have met at length and more than once with Jennifer Storm to talk about opportunities moving forward. In fact, we have had some significant discussions around Marsy's Law, which is an effort to elevate to a constitutional level the rights of victims. It has emerged in various forms, but in the form in Pennsylvania, it seems to be pretty responsible and appropriate, and we have been supportive of that effort. So at many different levels, we're trying to do this. I will say this, I think that there may be an assumption on the part of some people, and I certainly don't mean anyone in this council chamber, but I think there may be an assumption that when somebody spends a career as a defense attorney or as a civil rights attorney, that for some reason they would be ill-suited to sticking up for victims. I respectfully ask people to give us the opportunity, to give us a chance to do that. I don't think that that accurately describes a career that has consisted of sticking up for victims of HIV and AIDS and doing so for free. I don't think it accurately describes the career of someone who has repeatedly stuck up for underdogs and people who were being pushed down by society, including members of Black Lives Matter, members of Occupy. And I don't think it accurately reflects the career of someone who made a decision to move from the work he did previously in order to work with a movement that was trying to move towards a trauma-centered, different approach to criminal justice that would be ever better for everybody. We do not see a dichotomy in which victims are never offenders and offenders are never victims. And I know, Councilwoman, we've had this discussion ourselves, that there's wide recognition that people who are hurt will hurt other people if there's no effort to address their trauma. I mean, I have personally represented someone who was eventually convicted of a homicide and was raped as a 12-year-old in an alleyway by a stranger. Trauma that was really never addressed. So it is crucial. If you want to prevent crime, which I do, it is crucial to address the suffering and the experiences of victims in a way that is meaningful and appropriate. It stops future crime. It's just, it's right. It's the way we should treat people. And that is certainly what it is that I hope that this administration will do, and that what I want to do personally.
No, I agree. And, you and I certainly share that passion. I think it would be fair, given a more unusual background, but one in which folks supported in this city in overwhelming numbers, to recognize, though, that a lot of people want to see an affirmative approach on this area from the district attorney's office. Centering the voices of victims, of course, is a key aspect towards gaining the political will to marry, the reduction of mass incarceration with a true vision for what justice has to look like in our city. A side question that I wanted to ask is that there's been a lot of concern about witnesses who come forward and their vulnerability to be able to testify in some of the most terrifying circumstances. Especially when it impacts communities and neighborhoods, when people are impacted by those that they know and sometimes love. Can you talk a little bit about what your office is doing to improve the situation for witnesses who do come forward?
Well, I can. Part of this is an announcement that we have not made yet, and frankly, very exciting, unprecedented in the history of the city. I cannot give the full announcement here, but I can say this. People within this administration, even in a prior life, and also in their current life, have achieved great success in trying to do something that we expect to start soon in the city of Philadelphia, which is the establishment of unique advocates to work with families of homicide victims all over the city. And by work with, I mean this. I mean from the moment of the killing to go to the home of the family, to explain to them what previously homicide detectives had to do, to address their immediate traumatic reaction, to help them go to the medical examiner's office through the identification process, to help them immediately with any documentation requirements, to try to get funding for funerals, to help them through a funeral, to help them interface with detectives when they probably barely have the will to walk. This is good stuff. This should have been done a long time ago for a couple reasons. One, it's the right thing to do. Number two, our detectives are trying to solve homicides. When they don't solve them within 24 hours, they frequently don't solve them. Imagine the position of a detective who's not trained in trauma, who's just trying to do his or her job and trying to do it right away, and they have a family collapsing all around them with 100 questions hanging onto their arms as they are trying to get whatever information they need to investigate and get back out on the street. We have had a 37, maybe it's up to 40% homicide clearance rate in the city, which is not as good as it's been in this city, and it's not as good as in many other cities. Although, to be fair, it is better than some cities in the United States. And that rate needs to go up. What happens so often when we're not able to quickly get to the bottom of what the dispute was about is there's a retaliatory killing, and then there's another retaliatory killing. Those 24 hours are absolutely crucial. And through efforts of someone in this office, through efforts at the state level, we are very soon, for the first time, going to have a group of people able to do this and to stick with that family for at least the first 45 days so that they can take some of this weight off the detectives, so they can help with the suffering of the family and simultaneously do what your question addressed, Councilwoman, which is deal with how do you make them safe and secure. It's a lot easier for them to be safe and secure if they don't have to simply rely on a phone call to a prosecutor. They only meet after there's charging. And sometimes charging doesn't happen for quite some time after a homicide. And if they don't have to only rely on trying to call a single detective who can't be on shift 24/7, if they also have someone and an entire structure available to them full time. Now, obviously, there's a whole lot of nuts and bolts within the office itself. We're evaluating what's gone wrong, but we know that what's gone wrong in many instances is that resources that were there were simply not used. And it would be our intention to try to improve that as well.
So I had a couple of other questions, but just to close this out a little bit, in terms of, I guess part of the issue is around some of these protections for witnesses who are going to go on to the stand. They may not be members of the family that has been victimized directly, but how are we working to protect some of the witnesses who have to take on enormous risk with minimal, it seems, protections? We certainly had a number of cases that have been extraordinarily prominent in which, it's been shocking to see witnesses either murdered or abused, terrorized in ways that create a culture of silence and silencing and make it even worse for the families. Could you talk more specifically about witnesses who go on the stand that aren't victims?
I can say some things. There's other things I probably shouldn't say. I can tell you that some of the techniques that were used in the past, and I think used with perfectly good intentions, weren't as successful as they might have been because locations were used repeatedly. Types of locations were used repeatedly, either for protecting witnesses shortly before testimony or for relocation. That's not always the best strategy because doing the same thing over and over makes them much more susceptible to being harmed. I can tell you that there have been occasions when, the witnesses themselves, because of the type of location, engaged in activity that drew attention to them that shouldn't have been there. And so while, there were a lot of good ideas around the types of locations to use, we are moving in a direction of not being predictable and moving in a direction of locations where the temptation to engage in attention-gathering behavior wouldn't be there. I think that's probably what I can say in that regard. We don't, unfortunately, have the full resources that the federal government has had for what everybody thinks is available on TV, and that is, the permanent relocation with a change of identity and so on. And in many instances, witnesses don't even necessarily want to change their lives that much. But there is a lot more that can be done in terms of accompanying them, the appropriate use of the grand jury process, which can sometimes shield them because it is not known to a defendant or a defendant's family or defendant's friends exactly when some of that grand jury testimony would occur or where it would occur or that it's even occurring, because it's a secret procedure. And therefore, as opposed to having two major appearances at a preliminary hearing and also at a trial, with possibly some continuances in there in the middle where there could be danger, you can narrow that down to one area where there's danger. But ultimately, we also have to be willing, and we are willing, to go aggressively after anyone who is going to try to intimidate a witness in any kind of case. It goes to the fundamental accuracy of the criminal justice system that when people are intimidating witnesses, whether it's on Facebook, by cell phone, in person, by any other means, that we have to be willing to go after them hard for witness intimidation and for whatever underlying criminal conduct, whether it's terroristic threats or aggravated assault or whatever it may be. These, like corruption, these are practices that destroy the capacity of the court system to be accurate and to be effective, and they cannot be tolerated.
Thank you. I'll ask further questions later.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Chair recognizes Councilwoman Blackwell.
Thank you. I wanted to thank the DA for his creative leadership and for keeping his word from Election Day. Thank you for all that you're saying on victims and witnesses too. We've heard a lot over the years in this area. We try to work with Movita a lot and Phyllis Gibson, who works with her. And we look forward to only great things that come in the future. Thank you again.
That is too kind, but I guess you're welcome.
Good. Oh, thanks, Councilwoman. Chair recognizes Councilwoman Kiona Sanchez.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Councilwoman.
Want to go to an issue that was important, and then I have a question for Councilwoman Blondell Reynolds Brown, so I want to make sure it doesn't come from my time. But anyway, so my district was plagued with some of the utilization of the forfeiture fund. Can you speak to what's the current status of the fund? What was the financial impact to your budget, and how are you going to be able to make up those resources as we move away from a bad practice?
Councilwoman, thank you. The issues around forfeiture, needless to say, are that a lawsuit, which so far has been pretty effective, was brought against the city arguing that the district attorney's keeping what it kills, by which I mean forfeiting houses and cars and cash and then being able to dispense with the money themselves, including for their own salaries, was a fundamental conflict in violation of the Constitution. We have, that litigation is ongoing. We've met with the city solicitor's office at length, and it is increasingly clear that the small amount of funds that remain from that forfeiture fund cannot be touched by the district attorney's office or used, will ultimately end up in the hands of the city, it appears, and most likely that moving forward, this frankly weird practice where the district attorney's office, unlike any other agency, gets to keep the money that it gets from forfeiture will end, and any forfeiture monies will go into the general fund for the city of Philadelphia. So, we are in a moment of transition. Over a period of 11 years, the district attorney's office took almost $60 million in properties, in vehicles, and in cash from people, $60 million. I mean, that's effectively about $5 million, maybe a little bit more per year, which was at their disposal. It's not at our disposal anymore. The fact is, it was stealing. Not all of it, but maybe half of it was stealing. And the government should not steal from people. Grandmothers should not lose their houses. So that is a good thing that we're not stealing, but it does mean we don't have stolen money in our pocket. And that means we got a hole in our pocket, and that means that we have to be able to do something about it. The policy of the district attorney's office moving forward is going to be that with very few exceptions, we will only forfeit from people who've actually been themselves convicted of a crime, rather than what went on before, which is they would take money from people who weren't even charged with a crime or we're charged with a crime but we're not convicted. That is a fundamental violation of constitutional rights.
So how are you going to make up, and is the administration committed to helping you fill that hole, and how much is that? You say it averaged out $5 million. How much of that was staff salaries, and has the administration committed to help you bridge some of that gap?
Well, we do not have a commitment from the administration at that time to bridge the gap. We have raised a budget request of an increase of $5 million to try to put us back on track in terms of funding that will help us to carry out many important things. The truth is that we are going to be slimming down forfeiture because we're not interested in taking grandma's house and destabilizing her neighborhood anymore when her grandson did something she didn't know about. So we will be slimming that down, but that by no means solves the problem. We have to be able to do the things that are necessary in order to galvanize this office and make it a serious contender for improving the city. Let me just give you an example, just an example of what is the impact of being able to be adequately funded so that we are able to carry out some of our policies. If you look at the resentencings of juvenile lifers that are occurring during this administration, and the rest of them will be done within this administration, probably within the next 18 months. If we look at what was happening previously and what's happening now, there are certain instances in which we agree with the old administration when they were asking for astronomically long sentences, 50 years, 65 years, things like that. But there are many, many instances in which we are asking for sentences that are more in line with what's being done all across the country in other jurisdictions, 25 years, 20 years, 30 years, things of that sort. If we look at those 100 sentencings, understanding just on the back of the napkin here, doing the math, that on average, they may end up being about 10 years less, on average, than the prior administration's, frankly, excessive requirements. Well, 10 years times, we have over 100 to go, so let's just say 100, times a somewhat low price for incarceration of $42,000. Is what, $42 million? $42 million. I mean, we can sit here and we can talk about, oh my goodness, you want $5 million. That is just one of the things we're doing. That over the period of about 18 months, will chart expenditures around that small population of inmates towards a $42 million savings. Look at the chart we put up previously having to do with incarceration. When you start to have a reduction of 6 people a day, as opposed to 12 people a day in the county jails without endangering people, when you start to do that, and that expedites the date when you can close the House of Correction, so that maybe you can close it 6 months early. Well, we're talking about an annual potential savings by closing one prison that may be somewhere in the area of $75 or $100 million. Just give us credit for the 6 months. We're talking another $37.5 to $50 million being saved there.
So the administration in their presentation said that they added $4.5 million. So are you saying you still have a $500,000 gap? Or what is your request to council over and above?
Our request to council is $5 million per year. My understanding of what we've heard from the administration is $4.5 million over 5 years. So, so what is being offered is essentially about $850,000 per year. Part of the reason that we are trying so hard to be adequately funded is that there are new programs and new needs that we have that are real. We really do want to try to protect seniors. We really do want to stop house thefts, which are endemic. I mean, Philadelphia has a problem with phony deeds and house thefts that is unlike any other city I've seen. And, you know, perhaps most importantly, if there is any legacy that this administration leaves, its most important legacy will be the people we bring in. We have done a close and careful study of how recruiting was done previously, of diversity, of compensation for people, and, you know, the picture, frankly, is not good. The picture is of an office that was more interested in politics than it was in professionalizing things, and I say that for this reason. We have in fact, we have a graph on this. There has been an extremely local search for talent. May we go to slide number 4, please? As opposed to a national search for talent. This is where the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office has been hiring attorneys. And frankly, within that zone, they have been looking very selectively at certain schools, which often reflect schools that were attended by people within the administration itself. If we look at the next slide, which is slide 5, that will show you where we are recruiting and where we intend to recruit. Why are we doing this? Well, one of the important reasons is we want the best talent we can get. Another important reason is that we want diversity. We want diversity in our office. I had the opportunity to go speak with some NFL players at Harvard Law School not too long ago. I cannot tell you the number of Philadelphians at Harvard Law School or Boston University or Northeastern who came up to me wearing Eagles jerseys. These are people from Philly. These are our talented kids from Philly who went to Boston to go to these great law schools, and they want to come back. And whether they were at Harvard or not, they came to watch the speech. They came up after to talk to me. They came up to say they wanted to come back. Nevertheless, it turns out that this DA's office has not recruited at Harvard Law School ever. And according to my conversations with the woman who's in charge of public interest work at Harvard Law School, has even rejected applications coming from Harvard Law School. That just doesn't make any sense. You don't take your best kids from Philly who go to these great schools and say you cannot come back. We have great schools here too. But it's okay to have a diversity of where people have been educated. It's okay to have a diversity of academic talent. And perhaps, at least as important, it's okay to go see students of color who are at Harvard Law School and Yale Law School and Stanford Law School and the University of Texas and throughout the South, and who are at all these schools where this office has never gone for no good reason. It's okay to go there and say, we want you. We will take your applications. That if we can bring in people who have been doing their homework when they were 14 and are going to work 6 days a week and are super committed to the mission of this office, what we're going to see is that you won't be wasting that $40 million, because they'll know the bad guys. They'll go after the bad guys hard, but they're going to know when to exercise power with restraint. And the dollar savings that come from that approach, the reinvestment in schools so 16-year-olds don't want to drop out and pick up a gun, and they might actually finish their education, will stop crime. But we need that support. We need to be able not only to compensate a staff that has been very much underpaid in the first 15 years, we need to equalize discriminatory compensation against women in that office, discriminatory compensation against people of color in that office, and we need to bring in the best and the brightest. And there are so many talented people of color all over the country. You want to know why we have almost no Latinos in the office? Well, look where we did not recruit. We didn't recruit in California. We didn't recruit in Texas. When we went to New York, there's only 1 or 2 schools we would go to. What do you expect?
Right.
You know, this was not actually an accident. This was intentional. This was the people in charge wanting to replicate themselves and wanting to have the kind of office where they would not be challenged, where nobody would run against them when they ran for office. That's the opposite of what we need. We need an on-ramp for Philadelphia talent at the highest level to come back to this city and make this office an absolute top-shelf office.
Thank you. I'll come back in the next round. Just wanted to ask Councilwoman Blondell Reynolds-Brown, wanted to get an update on your conversations around truancy, particularly in relationship to DHS and the School District of Philadelphia.
I can say, and I'll try to be quick, I can say that we have met with Dr. Haidt, and we have spoken with a number of members of council and others who have a deep interest in this issue. The challenge here is to stop truancy as much as possible while simultaneously not repeating mistakes of the past where everything becomes an arrestable offense, and kids who should not necessarily be in a criminal system because often their involvement in the system makes them worse are not there. We are, you know, I don't consider myself to be the world's greatest expert on this, but I am blessed to have as one of my 2 first assistants, both of whom are sitting with me today, both Judge Temin, who brings incredible knowledge of the system and wisdom and independence to it, and also Robert Listenby, whose last job was being President Obama's and Eric Holder's Director for Juvenile Justice nationally, whose last budget was $250 million, and who, before he did all those great things, was the head of the juvenile unit of the Public Defender's Office for approximately about 18 years. Is that right, Bob? Right. So we have smarter people than me sitting next to me who are extremely engaged with this stuff and are going to help to guide us through it. And we are all ears for the council's interest in how we can address that.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Just point of clarification with respect to your recruiting. Are you suggesting that the last administration purposely didn't recruit from other locations, or there was not a people available in the city of Philadelphia who were qualified to diversify the office? Because I'm a lifelong Philadelphian, so I'm always thinking that we have everything. I'm just trying to get clarity. You're saying that there are not people here, Philadelphians locally, that would allow you to meet the level of diversity, and I want to commend you for having that in your department.
Well, what I'm saying is this. Our Philadelphians went to Harvard, and they went to Stanford, and they went to Yale, and they went to Texas, and they went to Emory, and they went to universities all over the country. And for some reason, the last administration was of the opinion that if you ever went anywhere else, you couldn't come back. These are kids coming out of Masterman, they're coming out of Central, they're coming out of some of our Quaker schools, they're going, our archdiocesan schools, their charter schools are going all over the country. They should be able to come back. We do not have to have a brain drain. Now, sure, there are great people here, and we will always continue to hire great people here. In fact, very recently, I made a commitment to co-teach a course in criminal justice with our public defender, who I consider to be a great partner in these efforts, for every Philadelphia school, meaning we will simultaneously teach students from Temple, from Drexel, also known as Thomas Klein, and also from the University of Pennsylvania, and to do that next year. We are never going to stop recruiting talent here. But it doesn't just have to end there. When you have an 8% population of people of color at Harvard Law School, and it's 600 kids, or 600 young people per class, you're looking at 50 people who are incredibly talented up there in that one school alone that have been in untapped resources and have been rejected when they tried to come home by an administration that wanted to make sure everybody in the office looked like themselves. I am saying there was a deliberate effort on the part of some people in that office to replicate themselves and to make sure the people they brought in would never challenge them. And unfortunately, that's what happens when you have a political office that is guided by people whose vision is limited.
Okay, I'm not sure that answers my question to a degree. And I'm asking this question for a reason. I'm really, we've been promoting Philadelphians first. And if we didn't have, we're second to Boston, maybe in terms of the number of educational institutions in the country. We got a lot of folks coming out of college, a lot of smart people. And you're saying you're going to recruit here locally, but in the event, and I just want to make sure that I understand, in the event that we're not able to get the level of talent here, and we should not be in a position where we don't go outside the city of Philadelphia to meet a particular goal, or meet a goal where you had not only diversity, but people willing to challenge and do the other things. Because I'm just trying to get clarity.
I guess it depends on how you define Philadelphia. And I think someone who comes from Cleveland, where they live their whole life and goes to a local law school, is a Philadelphian. But they're no more a Philadelphian than someone who's born and raised here and at age 18 goes away to school and wants to come back. If anything, the ones who went away want to come back. So we're
focusing on people that want to come back. We're not just focusing on...
I will be as candid as I can. We are focused on talent. But I am someone who went through public school in this area and went away to college in Chicago and law school in California, and I wanted to come back, and that's what I did. I think I'm a Philadelphian, and I think that there are not only a lot of great people here who stay in this area, but there are a lot of people who go away and want to come back. There's no reason in the world we should reject them. The truth is, this DA's office is not an A-list DA's office. It's not the first place that people think of when they're coming out of law school, because it has been so insular. It has been so accustomed to just being East Coast, to just being local. They go to New York. They don't go everywhere in New York. Trust me on that. They got a couple schools they like and a whole lot they don't. And there's a longer story there, but we don't need to get into it. This should be an office that attracts Philadelphians who have come from here, have gone away, and want to come back. And it should also attract people, as it always has, who are lifelong Philadelphians and have never left. It should not be a place where you have administration trying to bring in people who are just like themselves and making it into a grade B district attorney's office.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Chair recognizes Councilman Green.
Thank you, Council President. Thank you, District Attorney Krasner and your staff. You mentioned a number of great institutions like the University of Virginia at the North East, which is known as Harvard, or the University of Virginia of the Deep South, also known as Emory, but you forgot to mention the actual University of Virginia, which predates all those schools.
Well, you know, it was on the tip of my tongue, but then I said Emory, and I realized that we needed to spend more time on Virginia when your opportunity came. So
thank you. You learn about this politics very quickly, I see. A couple questions I want to touch base with you. We've talked in the past about at some point, hopefully in the future, of getting rid of cash bail. You've taken some policy steps within your office to do such. I had some questions. I'm not sure if you heard my colloquy with the First Judicial District earlier. Since some of the new initiatives that you've instituted in your office, have there been challenges that your ADAs have had with the arraignment court magistrates regarding bail, in reference to situations where either your office and or the public defender's office may have not asked for bail, but that bail amount has still been requested or instituted by the arraignment court magistrates?
So there certainly have been some instances in which the bail commissioners disagreed. I can tell you this, though, there's been nothing unusual. We are in our own lane. We're our own branch of government. We don't expect to control what the judiciary does. We realize that we will not always be right, and they will not always be right, and we might both be right and not agree. That's just how it is. But we have not experienced much in the way of difficulty. We have seen in general that the policies and the recommendations that we are making are being followed. We also have the capacity, when we feel like there has been a decision that's worth appealing, we have the capacity to appeal to a municipal court judge, and we feel like we're getting significant support from the municipal court judiciary, who do have some influence over the bail commissioners in that regard. So we are not given that we are in a moment of cultural change, we're not experiencing anything that I would consider to be, inappropriate and normal differences of opinion.
In my questions and also some correspondence that I, along with Councilman Jones, sent to President Judge Wood Skipper, and then we also received information back from Municipal Court Judge Neifeld, was made reference to a committee that reviews bail commissioners as well as reviews their reappointment. In the information that was presented today and also in the correspondence, it was stated that both the Public Defender's Office and the District Attorney's Office have an opportunity to participate in that committee. Is that a committee that you're aware of, and any steps you plan on participating?
We do plan on participating in it. I'm aware of it now that you mention it to me, which is just one more recommendation for the University of Virginia. But I was not aware of it previously, and yes, we do intend to participate.
Okay, thank you. Also, we've had a earlier conversation regarding a recent resolution I introduced regarding the use of THC, or the chemical, in cannabis for screening for those on probation or parole. And I wanted to get some of your thoughts on that issue, and also hopefully have the ability of your office to participate in future hearings that we anticipate in the Law and Government Committee.
Number one, I'm very willing and interested in participating in future hearings having to do with issues surrounding policy around cannabis or THC. Number two, my administration in mid-February released a written policy stating that we will, absent truly extraordinary services, almost never seek the revocation of probation or parole simply because of the presence of THC in the blood of someone who is or urine of someone who is a parolee or a probationer. This is actually a much bigger problem than people realize. And as I mentioned, we're going to have a very, very important report released from Columbia University this week about how off the rails Pennsylvania is in terms of its excessive probation and parole. The truth about this, just to put it in a nutshell, is marijuana is an awful lot like beer. It's something kids shouldn't drink, but it is something that other people drink. The difference, of course, to the extent there is one, is that it is scientifically clear that marijuana and THC are not physiologically addictive, while if you just keep drinking beer long enough, it can be. So the notion that it's A-OK for people to drink a couple beers every night and they wouldn't be revoked on probation or parole, but oh my goodness, if there's little THC in their system, we're going to revoke them right now, is a relic of another time. It's a relic of the 1950s and the 1960s and Richard Nixon and his nonsense propaganda, and it has nothing to do with criminal justice that makes any sense. I am not saying that if you're driving under the influence, we won't count it. Obviously, driving under something that is psychoactively affecting you, that is a separate crime. That's a different deal. I'm not saying that we wouldn't revoke someone for selling marijuana. That's a different deal. But if we're simply talking about the presence of digested THC in the system of a person that is not any other violation of the law, this office is not putting people in jail for that. This office is going to make sure that money goes to our public schools.
Thank you. Also, during the back and forth of questions and responses regarding recruiting, and you talked about your desire to have a more diverse staff and taking additional efforts in recruitment. And also, prior to that, you talked about your budget request and the difference between your request and actually the amount of dollars that were actually identified in the budget for your office. Can you give some more perspective in reference to the impact that has on some of the initiatives you're trying to get done as a district attorney, and how the reduction of resources will impact your ability to do some of the things we talked about in our previous conversation about expungement work that you're doing and other things. And I know that has an impact. I know you're also trying to address the issue of pay parity. That's something that's also a concern that I have, not only with your office, but also in the public defender's office, making sure that we have pay equity for those who are taking on the public service of being either a public defender or a district attorney or a member of the law department. So can you give some perspective on how the impact of having not the dollars that you requested has a ripple effect on some of the other things you're trying to do to address some of the public safety issues and concerns we have in our city?
Yes, Councilman, thank you. May we see slide 6, please? This is just a rough look at the options available to a young, talented attorney, whether coming from a school that is in Philadelphia or coming from another school and hoping to come back to Philadelphia. This gives you some idea of what beginning pay looks like in these different major cities. On the left, you see Philadelphia at a little bit under $52,000. Every other one of these cities, Phoenix, Seattle, Houston, Chicago, San Francisco, is at least in the 60s. San Francisco is at $114,000 as a beginning salary. When we took these numbers and we factored in cost of living, it remained the lowest compensated of every one of these cities that we looked at. Essentially Philadelphia, if you were in San Francisco, you would be making what looks like $70,000 there as opposed to what they're paying. So, talented people who want to come back to Philly have to deal with the reality that they have an enormous amount of student loan debt, especially if they grew up in public schools, they grew up working class or maybe middle class. They're going to have to find some way to pay that couple $1,000s a month and also be able to have clothing and food and shelter and that sort of thing. And this is one of the issues that we face. We face the inequity of attorneys in their first 15 years being paid too little, and much of our limited budget having been run away with by people at the highest levels in the senior administration. But we also find that within that group of attorneys, especially in the first 15 years, there are some very significant pay inequities. We find indications, for example, that women across the board are paid on average significantly less. We found specific instances where women who had tremendous qualifications, had done great work, very meritorious employees 10, 11, 12 years in, were actually being paid $10,000, $12,000, $13,000 less than an attorney who was male and had 3 years less experience. There are indications of individual favoritism. There are indications of sexism. There are indications of discrimination according to race. And we are trying to do everything we can to regularize it. It has been an absolute crucial part of what we've been up to for 4 months. What we are seeking in this budget includes funds that allow us to rectify that, to make us as attractive as we need to be. And one of the greatest problems this office has had for many years is we train these very talented young attorneys for 5, 6, 7 years, and because they're so undercompensated, barely compensated often beyond the funding that they had in the first year, very slight raises, that they will go on to do other things. Cozen and O'Connor would like them for $50,000 more, thank you very much. And you know what? If they were making another 10, 12 grand, they might even turn down that money and they might stay because a lot of them love what they're doing. We had a particularly difficult problem at one point in that we had this group of very, very talented attorneys of color 5, 6, 7 years in, down with the mission. They would have been wonderful employees. I would have been thrilled to have them stay. But large law firms also seeking to hire diversity saw the opportunity to take all of the money that had been invested in their training for 5, 6, 7 years, grab them, and take them into their law firms. We have to be able to compete at some level. We're never going to pay big law firm money. I'm not asking for that. But we need to be able to hang on to this incredible talent. They're not just people who could be great career prosecutors. They are our future leadership in the city of Philadelphia as it goes forward. And we have to be able to do more than just watch them all run out the door because they are so undercompensated. So in terms of the, the specific aspects of the programs they're trying to reach or programs they're trying to do, I can tell you that for the fiscal year 19 salary increases, and we have provided this documentation, we can provide more. We're looking for $1.4 million for that. This is not a phony number. We have done all the analysis up and down the line, looked at all the categories, come with the system, vetted it. I have a commitment that we will have support from the mayor in reference to this and other aspects. We're looking to expand our conviction integrity unit with 3 new ADAs, a paralegal and a detective. That is a $465,000 expense. We're looking to increase community engagement, which is crucial to being able to achieve the many, many different things we're trying to do here. That requires a couple of mid-level ADAs and a paralegal at $550,000. We have new initiatives around drug treatment courts, ideally doubling the court, getting the people who are using marijuana, who fill up 70% of the spots for no good reason, out of there, so we can put people suffering from opiate addiction into that doubled court. We're looking at bail reform, fraud and corruption prosecutions, improving communications and transparency in an office that has been viewed as a closed box for a long time at $550,000. There are other new strategic positions we're seeking at a cost of $690,000. And as I mentioned, all of this has been provided, or if it has not, we can provide it again so that there are specifics around it. We have tremendous needs in terms of IT. This is, honest to goodness, when I walked in and saw the IT in that office, I thought I was back in 1986. It's not a small thing. There are jurisdictions where tremendous savings are being accomplished. For example, in Houston, where they had a flood and they had to switch towards a paper-free or less paper system. Yeah, it cost a little bit of money. The savings going forward are overwhelming. We have a floor of the offices where we are that's basically dedicated to paper when that doesn't need to be. We have people routinely hauling around, 10 or 12 or 20 boxes on a complex homicide case when so much of that could have been dedicated to paper. So we do have a plan around IT. A lot of it is just a one-time expense that includes various different aspects. I'm trying to grab a total for you, which I have here somewhere, but I can tell you to upgrade software, we're looking at $150. Migrate from Novell to Microsoft AD, we're looking at $25 with a recurring increase of $400,000. But the savings coming back, frankly, will overwhelm the expense in order to move from the 1980s toward being the A-list office that this office really should be, and the savings that can be achieved from that. We have certain needs around geospatial prosecution software so that we can be as effective as police departments can be, if not more, in terms of our ability to chart activity, wars that are going on, shootings that are occurring, gang activity of different types. This is the kind of thing that saves lives and solves cases, and it becomes evidence to present in court. Our policy work so far has been great. Some of it has, frankly, been limited by the resources that we have. And let's not forget, to the extent an office that is just as big as Houston, but has, in terms of personnel, but only has 2/3 the budget of Houston, to the extent that office, because it is progressive, because there is interest nationally in what it's doing, can attract outside funding for nonprofits to provide new services, you can have a doubling and a tripling of the capacity of this office to serve victims, to do restorative justice, to prevent recidivism, to help at-risk youth, all of that, none of it coming at the expense of Philadelphians who are already burdened. But it all comes from having the right hires, being able to support the right people you need to keep, being able to move forward with a mission on different fronts that can do so much for the city.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair.
Good afternoon. First, let me thank Councilwoman Sanchez for putting on the record an issue and concern a number of my colleagues and I continue to have around truancy. I heard the tail end of that as I was entering my office. So in the years that I've been here, there continues to seem to be gaps, the linkages between the school district and your office, and then separately DHS. The links have not come together yet. And in listening to DHS doing their budget testimony, it appears that we're still in the figuring it out stage. And every year we figure it out and lose a year, we're losing more young people. So can you speak to, in the short time that you've been there, what the plans are to bring those three worlds together and figure out more, in a more tangible way, how we can minimize young people who ultimately end up in family court? Because it typically starts, the red flag is truancy. Have you had a chance to look at that in depth with those two particular agencies? And if yes, what might those plans be from where you sit?
Very briefly, let me just say that I am blessed to have as one of my two incredibly capable first assistants, Robert Listenby, who is sitting to your right and my left, whose last job was basically juvenile justice on a national scale for Eric Holder and for President Barack Obama. I am in many respects deferring to him, not only based upon that, but also based upon the fact that he was the chief of juvenile in the public defender's office for almost 19 years, and I probably am mixing up the number of years every time I say it, but more than 1 year, and also a Stoneleigh Fellow with tremendous expertise nationally. His life's work has been juvenile justice and the interconnections of these groups. Together, we have done a variety of things that I think are very important and closely related. We are seeing a very significant decrease in the number of juveniles who are going into adult court to face charges. We are seeing a significant reduction in the number of juveniles who are actually held up on State Road in an adult facility. I think we've gone from about 28 down to approximately 12 at the moment. We're moving towards getting them out. But I would, if I may, I'd like to defer to Mr. Listenby for a minute to talk about the meetings that he has been having.
Okay.
I have been in some of them, but you know, I try to hire people who are smarter than me, harder working, and more likable, and he's one of them.
Ditto.
So if we might give him a moment.
I'd appreciate that, particularly as we now anticipate budget hearings with the school district a couple of weeks from now.
Madam Councilwoman, just a couple of things. We recognize that with the juvenile courts as they are, that there have been significant decreases in the number of young people who've been going into the courts. Law enforcement has joined with us with the efforts of former Deputy Commissioner Kevin Bethel and his law enforcement diversion program that has worked to divert approximately 1,000 young people per year out of the criminal justice system and juvenile justice systems, which has helped us make some progress. DHS has cooperated with its prevention programs, and those young people are diverted to DHS's prevention program. We at the District Attorney's Office have had some pretty good success with our youth aid panels with volunteers from throughout the city. We previously had as many as 1,500 per year. That number, the need itself has been decreased to about 400 to 500 per year. In fact, we have our first volunteer group coming up this evening. Now, the challenges that we have with the juvenile justice system specifically are as follows. One, so many of our young people who go into placement, that number is about 800 to 900 a year at the present time, come back to our schools without having had a level of education consistent with what they had here or consistent with what their actual needs are. So they come back and often drop out of our school systems shortly after they get back, usually within about 3 months. So we do need
3 months?
That's the number that I have based upon discussions I've had and also reports that I've read. I haven't had any recent experience having tabulated it directly, but that's what the research is telling us. There is a dire need to focus on educational opportunities for our young people who are in out-of-home placement. We also need to reduce the number of young people who are going 300-400 miles away from home, because that doesn't help them any more than it helps to send adults far away. And also, Madam Chairwoman, it needs to be recognized that if those people young people are going to state facilities run by our juvenile justice programs, The amount that costs is about $215,000 per year per child. That is correct, $215,000 per year per child for secure confinement for our young people in state facilities. That number comes from the state itself. We can provide copies of that information if you really need it. And we need to reduce that number because often we're taking young people who've been charged with minor offenses, misdemeanors, and sending them to state placement. This is particularly egregious when it comes to girls. We have, there's nothing in our system here in Philadelphia between going to a detention facility, in the juvenile justice facility in West Philadelphia, and going to a state secure confinement. There are no programs in between. So you're either in detention or in a state secure confinement. We need alternative programs right here in Philadelphia for our young ladies in particular. That is particularly egregious. The heads of the juvenile justice system in Harrisburg would agree with that. I've had recent discussions with them as recently as last week, and we need to pay close attention to that. Overall, we need to find ways to keep our young people closer and provide treatment alternatives here. We recognize that most of our young people, when I say about 60% of our young people in our juvenile justice system have significant mental health disorders. We need to address those better and more comprehensively, and that needs to be done well. We also recognize that over 50%, based upon national averages, have substance abuse disorders, and we need to address those. So we have some significant problems remaining, and we need to address them in a comprehensive fashion. We're looking at ways where we can have the district attorney meet with folks who've addressed these problems in other states. New York City with a close to home initiative, Texas with a close to home initiative, Georgia where they do not permit the courts to send their young people charged with misdemeanors to detention or placement. So there's some better ways that have been developed across the nation. I've observed these by traveling to many of these states and funding many of these programs as administrator of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. We in Philadelphia need to be open to these ideas, and the district attorney has asked me to work closely with all the major stakeholders to meet with them, to discuss these issues with them, work closely with them, and see if we can find some better ways. And he's available to meet with them at a time when people have reached some consensus about where we want to go, and he's tasked me with moving forward.
Okay. Thank you for your comprehensive answer or explanation. There are parts of it that are very alarming. So a question I thought of last week with DHS that I'll ask you directly. Is it time to have a formal convening task force of all the stakeholders you've mentioned, including DHS and the school district, so that we can formally communicate, talk across tables and departments to figure out how we send fewer kids out of the state? I thought that number was on the decline. I'm not so sure, haven't heard your explanation, because that was one of my itch areas when I arrived in City Council some time ago. So state placements and alternative programming for girls is alarming. There's work and opportunities, I think, but we cannot operate, as you well know, in silos. Sure. So the question is, do you think it's time for a formal organized task force around this issue of truancy and all its related parts on a regular basis?
I do, Madam Chairman. I believe that there's a need for that kind of leadership to go forward. But again, I defer to the district attorney in terms of what he wants me to do and in terms of what priority this serves within his office. Well
taken. Okay, our office will follow up accordingly. My second question is also related to your commitment, if you will, to this issue of gender parity that Councilwoman Sanchez raised as well. So you, again, listening briefly while upstairs, could you simply describe how you secured your findings in such short order, please?
Yes. I can tell you that from the moment we came in, we made it an absolutely top priority, both with Chief of Staff Arun Prabhakaran and also with our CFO Keith Dotson, both of whom are here. Gentlemen, please raise your hands so they can see your handsome selves. We made it an absolute top priority to try to figure out the compensation system. We put together in a database various criteria, including things like gender and race, number of years out of law school, years of experience, assignment, things of that sort, in order to try to analyze to what extent we were looking at a mess of favoritism of various different types, potentially sexism, racism, etc. And we found certain patterns, including finding some data indicating that women on average, and I'm now speaking, I believe, of the entire staff, but on average we're being paid about 9% less. Let me take that back, about $9,000 less than men in similar positions. Obviously, having lived with an employment discrimination lawyer who represented a lot of women for 15 years, I know that you have to look very, very carefully because sometimes these results reflect generational issues and so on.
Sure.
But we also found discrete individual examples that seemed to be conspicuous. I mean, I can tell you, I've actually been handed some of the data that we located, and I can tell you in general that on this data, among full-time staff, it appears that women were paid about 6.3% lower than men. It appears that on average, people of color were paid about 10% less than people who are white. So it's something we need to look at very carefully. Obviously, we want to be fair to everybody, and we don't want to be simplistic about this, but it's concerning, and it's even more concerning when you see specific examples of pay that doesn't seem to make sense. When you look at levels of experience, you look at evaluations and merit, and you look at other aspects
Surely.
of it.
Well, recognition is the first step towards righting a ship, and you need to know that gender parity has always been a major interest of members of this legislative body, so to know that you recognize it will not happen organically, it has to be intentional efforts by leadership matters. I have other questions, but we need to circle and give other members an opportunity. Councilman Teutenberger?
Madam Chair. Thank you very, very much. Mr. Krasner, you had talked earlier in your testimony briefly, and we have chatted about it actually as recently as yesterday, and that is house thefts. In some cases, it's a criminal trespass. Could you elaborate a little further, for the record, what your office intends to do? And would you also consider potential increase in staff for this? Because you're the first district attorney in my time in council that has actually sought to address this issue, and I'm very much appreciative of that.
Councilman, I appreciate your comments and your interest. It is my sense that the district attorney's office has actually created a vacuum completely unnecessarily that has allowed a type of crime that frankly seldom exists in other cities to exist here. And that is the crime of people showing up with a phony deed to a house they never lawfully obtained and they never lawfully purchased. It either has a fraudulent notarization from the owner with a fraudulent signature, or often what it has is a photoshopped notarization taken from another document. It's presented, very often against a vulnerable victim, either an elderly person who has gone into nursing care, or someone who is traveling, or someone who may be living in such poverty that they don't even have the capacity to respond to it. In the past, people often didn't even know it was occurring. Now there are efforts made by the Recorder of Deeds to send a letter to the address of the deed. But that is only going to be successful if the owner is still in that house, which often does not happen. What then often occurs once the house is stolen in this fashion is that we have either knowing or unknowing tenants who are moved in, and they have a lease that they know to be fraudulent, or often a lease they do not know to be fraudulent. Similar things are happening in West Philadelphia, where you have people who are purporting to be agents or they're purporting to be landlords. They're taking first and last month's deposits for apartments, to which they have no relation.
Right.
And they're leaving people in the lurch. This is, it's not frankly too different than the kind of fraud that's being perpetrated on elderly people by contractors, where you take vulnerable victims who, whose key asset may be their home, or their key asset may be a home that's got a roof leak. And at their most vulnerable, you're going to steal whatever assets they have from them and make them go to lawyers they cannot afford to try to right this wrong. It's pretty terrible. And what makes it even worse is that I had a conversation with a person involved in a prosecutorial agency who informed me that it was the policy of the prior administration that they wouldn't go after a house thief unless that house thief had 20 thefts. Can you imagine a world where we only prosecute car thieves if they take 20 cars?
It's unbelievable.
you'd have a lot of stolen cars.
Absolutely.
So that's what we have going on here, and the problems are very difficult for police as well, because police have good training on what you're supposed to do when a landlord is trying to use police to evict tenants that is protective of lawful tenants who may have a dispute with the landlord about rent, or they may have a dispute with the landlord about maintenance of the property. And so police officers show up for people who either know or don't know that they're not permitted to be there. The police are presented with a lease that looks to be authentic. Somebody's got a deed that looks to be authentic, and the police do what they're supposed to do, which is they go away.
Yeah.
So it festers, and often, what comes behind it may be that the house becomes a drug house, or the house becomes a place where there's other illegal activity, including sex work. It can be very destabilizing and upsetting to neighbors who can get into confrontations with people who have moved into Mr. Smith's or Mrs. Smith's home, and those people feel protective of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and so they're making some efforts to drive people out of that property. None of this ever should have happened.
Correct.
It has happened. Resources are needed, and so when I was elaborating some of the reasons why we're seeking the $5 million in funding, and I spoke about funding for ADAs to assist with fraud and corruption, this would actually be one of our key priorities in going after crimes that are committed not only against Philadelphians, but also committed disproportionately against people who are senior.
Mr. Krasner, thank you very much. Madam Chair, thank you.
Councilman, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Just as an alert, we have until 2 o'clock, and we have 3 members remaining, so I would ask that we simply be mindful of the time, and you can be assured that many of us will be meeting you offline to follow up as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
You're welcome. Councilwoman Blackwell?
I asked the courts, and I've talked to the DA about it, but the Youth Study Center is saying that it's the DA's office who makes that decision about sending 20-year-old males and above to Youth Study Center from State Road. So I'm asking you to look into that. I mentioned we're having a big problem with older young people going to Youth Study Center with the younger ones, and how they're terrorizing the place. Would you look into that for me?
I would like to defer to First Assistant Liston in one moment on that point, but I do want to say that it's an issue that has been raised with us previously, and I think we have some information to offer on that.
Thank you.
Councilwoman Blackwell, I will certainly take a look into it. We had met with representatives from the center last week. That issue was not raised with the people that I sent over to meet with them, but I will personally meet with them and have this discussion to find out exactly what we can do. To the best of my knowledge, we're not sending 20-year-olds over there, but I will check and confirm, and we will get back to you on that with a great deal of specificity. What we are doing is we are decertifying young people who we feel can work effectively within the juvenile justice system. I've had no indications that we've had any problems with that. We are taking a great deal of care to only deal with those who are appropriate for the juvenile justice system, and there are some who are not appropriate for the juvenile justice system. And we take guidance from the district attorney on that, and I'm also aware, based on my own personal experiences, that there are some young people who are not appropriate for the center. So we will continue to talk with them and with DHS and with Judge Murphy. In fact, I have an upcoming meeting with her kind of soon to see if there's some issues that we need to address, and we will get back to you on it.
Thank you. They mentioned members of Local 2186, and they sent another letter just now. So I will, I will pass this on to you so that you will have what I have, and then I'd appreciate you getting back to me.
Madam Councilwoman, I do want to add that at the present time, the young people who are there have been decertified back to the youth study, back to the detention center. If we were to have young people who are currently at PIC over there, then they would be separated by some sort of physical barrier from the young people who are held there at the Youth Study Center, who are typically there for a shorter period of time. So if that were to happen, we would have that separation. That is what the folks at the Youth Study Center have indicated to me they plan to do. That has not happened yet, though. And I will certainly be in contact with you about any plans to do that.
Thank you. They say, for example, number one, staff have been assaulted, causing serious injury to include needing surgery, and that they find these kids out of control. Sometimes they don't have enough staff on duty as per regulations. A longtime employee of Youth Study Center has recently lost his job as a result of defending himself from being brutally attacked by a 6'5", 240-pound resident of Youth Study Center, and that these residents have caused riots in the Youth Study Center. So they sent 5 issues, but I will pass this on to you.
Thank you very much.
And I thank you for your willingness to look into this. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're very welcome. I want to remind my colleagues we have a hard stop at 2, and so with that, we have 3 remaining members. Councilwoman Gim.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So effective communications with victims who are immigrants and have limited English proficiency is incredibly important right now, especially given the current national climate. So can you talk about some ways that you're working to infuse cultural sensitivity and competency in the training of DAs, and in particular, speaking about your work to better serve immigrant communities and improve language access through the DA's office?
Yes, and thank you for that, Councilwoman. So, one crucial aspect of this is that we not create a category of unprotected victims. And what has been going on, due in large part to the Trump policy around immigration, is that you have victims and you have witnesses. And they're not always just victims, they're not always just witnesses for other immigrants, but they are witnesses for crimes that occur in the city of Philadelphia who are afraid to engage with the police. They're afraid to even call the police. They're afraid to go to a courthouse. They're afraid to engage with district attorneys for good reason. And that is that they know that in this hyperactive environment around Philadelphia that ICE may sweep them up. Has been known to do it. You may recall not so long ago that our president ordered the deportation of a woman who went to court because she was being physically abused, because he wanted to make the point, and he made the point. And of course, the terrible problem that occurs with all of this, and I say this to you as someone who for a number of years was actually counsel to the Mexican consulate in Philadelphia, whose degree in college was a degree in language, specifically the Spanish language, and who represented Spanish-speaking people, often with as many as 40% of my clientele being Spanish-speaking. The problem is you go to places where there are American criminals who know that they can rob immigrants and they can sexually assault immigrants. And
Mr.
they can
Krasner, just because I know my colleague is going to be very clear about my time limits, I'm just asking if you could help us. I can only give you like a minute and a half to just help me answer the question about what your office is doing to better serve immigrant communities and improve language access.
No, I appreciate that.
I have 2 other questions I want to put on the record.
Understood. Let me expedite. I apologize. I was getting off track a little bit.
I never contest the Madam Chair.
But that, the aspect of protecting immigrants so they will even engage in conversation with us is crucial. Now, when it comes to language access, yes, the office has a database of all the different attorneys and staff who speak languages, but that's not good enough. We need to have people who are fully capable linguistically to help with a multiplicity of language. That is something that is actively underway. It's being led mostly by my chief of staff in terms of, seeking to have a contract that will enable us to have language services to a wide array of different linguistic needs across the board.
So we'll follow up with you on some of the more specifics, but I know that that's been a serious issue in the past and would like to just keep tabs on how that's working.
Yes, please.
So recently as I said before with Judge Wood Skipper, the Philadelphia ICE office has been identified as the most aggressive in the country. 40% increase in the last year of people raided and detained. Almost 2/3 of people have no criminal convictions or criminal background and history. A lot of this is because our criminal justice database system, PARS, has allowed people to access and potentially profile folks as well. But what will your office do to ensure that ICE does not have access to a database in a way that that allows folks to be racially profiled and rated in our city?
I mean, the simplest answer is that our assistant district attorneys are not going to be permitted to contact ICE without approval from the top. It never should have been that they were rogue actors, contrary to policy, and that in terms of any vote that the district attorney has with reference to sharing of data with ICE, it is my intention to vote against it. The danger of that position, and people have talked about it, is actually somewhat mitigated now by a very important decision that has produced a national injunction against the linking of policing funds to whether or not you're a sanctuary city, that came out a couple weeks ago. So that makes it easier for us to maintain that position, and that is our position.
So for clarity, that the PARS database in particular, you're still working through what your office has the power to be able to do in terms of limitations? I understand that no ADA can contact ICE proactively.
I mean, obviously this is a somewhat longer talk, but the district attorney does have a vote annually, as I understand it,
Right.
on the sharing of information with ICE. That my vote will be against that.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that for
Sure.
me again. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. We're going to honor the clock because we have to, and we have two members remaining, Councilman Squilla, and we'll close with Councilwoman Sanchez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Mr. Krasner, for your visit the other day, for the meeting we had. I thought it was great, and as we talked about it, I mentioned it to some of our colleagues about the interest in doing some type of press conference to go after some of our doctors that are assisting in our opioid crisis. And I think it's a great idea to be able to work with council, with the administration, with your office, the Attorney General, and with the federal government to really send a message to let our constituents know that if they see doctors that are providing far too many scripts or cash doctors for any reason, that they could either contact our office to get to you, and also to look at our pill mill legislation to see how we could attack them on their business license to be able to stop what we believe is a predatory giving of prescriptions to the folks in our communities that are adding to our opioid crisis. And I think that was an idea that you brought up. I think we are looking to move forward on that, so thank you. My question is, I received an email today about a concern from one of our animal advocates, and they were worried about it was an issue in Philadelphia about a dog fighting case, and that I guess was a felony charge, and some of the officers, I guess, were downgraded to misdemeanors. Is there a reasoning for that type of suggestion, or do we believe that certain people still will be charged at a higher rate than others who are involved in that?
Councilman, I will say as much as I can because it's a pending matter, and you should know that I have had a conversation directly with the CEO of the Pennsylvania SPCA, and we'll be meeting with her later this week, as well as with some of the law enforcement related to it, going through the file and making sure we have a mutual understanding. What I can tell you about that is that there is a group of people, which is at least half and maybe even the majority of those people, who are facing felony charges and will continue to face felony charges. It is a group of people that consisted of individuals who either owned dogs, handled dogs, had some relation to the premises where it occurred, or had some kind of record that indicated serious criminal activity or involvement with animal abuse in the past. Those people are all headed towards a felony process, which will include a preliminary hearing and an eventual trial. Problem with that group, though, which gets to the heart of the issue, is that takes a long time. It can take 9 months, 12 months, 15 months, and often what happens with these cases is that the creatures who suffer the most are the dogs, because until there is a judicial order to move the dogs out of shelter, they will sit in a cage. And there have been instances under the prior administration where those dogs went from the worst kind of abuse you can imagine, being used for fighting, and then they sat in a cage for 9, 12, or more months with no one dealing with their trauma, no one trying to rehabilitate them. The only way that this office achieved having those dogs moved out of shelter and into rehabilitation was through the process of resolving some of the other cases where there were not all these other factors involved, where you essentially had a potential mere presence defense, and you didn't have other factors that indicated greater involvement. Now, I'm not here to say that we have necessarily handled the case perfectly or imperfectly, but I am here to say that one of the great problems we have with animal cruelty cases is that the animals shouldn't be treated in a way so that they're strictly simply stuck in a cage and they sit there for 12, 15 months, only to find at the end, as has happened in the past, that even people who are facing felony charges often get probation or they get convicted on lower charges, and the ones who suffer through the whole process are the dogs. So that, but let me also say this, I believe that we are not perfect. I certainly know I'm not perfect, and I'm delighted to have the chance to sit down with the PSPCA and see if there are ways we can do these things better.
Well, I appreciate that, and I think it's just an answer that we could give to some of the constituents about concerns, and you know, instead of forwarding over to you, we could say that we asked you these questions directly, and you were able to answer them. And thank you. And if we have other questions that we have, we could ask you personally. And thank you for being available to us.
Thank you, Councilman. It's a pleasure speaking to you.
Before we move to our last member, I do want to put on the record that Councilwoman Sherelle Parker had an emergency in her district, and she has a number of questions here for the Economic Crimes Unit, of which I will pass to you and ask if you would have you or a member of your team respond to her via email. Please.
We certainly will. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Okay, then. Thank you. Councilwoman Sanchez?
Thank you, and I'll be brief. Just to kind of follow up on the opioid, the administration last week agreed that it was important for them to develop some sort of matrix for us to follow the doctors that work for us, because while we were out there preaching to the private sector, we don't have an internal accountability measure. So we will be seeking your advice about what they should be looking for as they monitor the doctors that work and at some point get reimbursed by the city of Philadelphia, as the feds have closed 4 of our mental health organizations funded by the city. And so we clearly have an internal problem. So I'll follow up with that. Let me suggest that in light of the fact that we're moving away from forfeiture and you have a gap within your budget, that between now and the time we finish our budget cycle, maybe the council president can host a meeting with our budget folks, because I'm very much interested in making sure that we leave you whole, and that some of the initiatives that we've requested that the DA's office continue to expand can actually happen, including your recruitment and pay equity, which again, we legislate, and I think it's important that if we're going to legislate it, that we also be part of the solution. My last question is, and I want you to think about this as we move forward, and the courts were here earlier, we'll then have our public defenders. In the CJAB discussion, I think it's important that we figure out through the MacArthur Foundation, if not just because we should, we're trying to get to performance-based budgeting, and what is going to be the matrix about the values that are attached from the different, what I call the Justice League, right? All of the CJAB members. What is the different matrix so that we can really measure savings and reinvestment? We seem to be having some challenges around how different departments are doing that. And if you've given it any thought to that, and if not, if at a future date we can have that discussion. I know Councilman Jones as a member of CJAB. I think it's really important because when we talk about savings at the state, you started off with talking about the inherent discrimination and the economic benefits reaped by the state, right, in the prison complex. So how are we going to show savings if in fact there is the willingness, the political willingness by the state to just continue to fund this? And I know what the governor has said, right? So have you given that a little bit of thought? Because, you know, state time, state jail time, there's no calculation locally for us, right, for savings. So has the CJAB given any thought about how it's looking at that through MacArthur?
Well, I don't want to speak for the CJAB, especially 115 days in. I can certainly tell you that my office has done something that I guess is radical but probably shouldn't be, which is that we have a criminologist in-house, and he is quantifying things all the time. And one of the things that I think is most important to quantify is the data around what happens when there are savings. There are people within the state system who are of the opinion that our population of nearly 50,000 state prisoners should be more like 20,000 1,000 in order to be in line with appropriate levels in other states. That ain't a small number. When you start taking 30,000 and multiplying it out times $42,000 a year, I mean, you can all do the math on that, but it gets nuts. It's a ton of money that we're talking about potentially saving at the state level. I would like to think that the state doesn't hate Philadelphia so much all the time that Philadelphia will not be so powerless all the time moving forward that there will never be a relationship between proper reinvestment statewide and what's good for the city. But we are stuck in the same cycle as California, where you have these large cities that are progressive and democratic that are in a sea of more rural communities that have a different culture and sometimes, frankly, don't agree. It's a challenge that we're going to have moving forward. In terms of specific metrics, there are a lot of metrics about current and future dollars related to incarceration.
So we'd like to see, again, categorically, some of the savings, right? So one of the numbers that I put out to the President Judge was the issue of police time and police overtime related to prosecution. So again, as we talk through this budget, I think it's important for us to be able to look at that, right? Are we going to go back to some of the preliminary hearing stuff at the districts that save on that budget overtime for the police department? It's going to be a major discussion next week. I'm sure your folks are going to follow it. So any thoughts on that?
Well, I do have thoughts on that. And then in a second, I'd like to defer to Bob because he has something to say as well. But I mean, I was asked by the commissioner and the mayor to look at this issue a few months ago, and we've been looking at it as quickly and intensively as we can. We actually have a meeting scheduled with the 3 individuals in the police department identified by Fran Healy, who is effectively the attorney. That meeting is tomorrow. And you know, the main issues here are that you have a ton of people who are police officers who come down to testify. They may not testify at all. They may come down unnecessarily for preliminary hearings. And they are incentivized, frankly. The system incentivizes it by paying a minimum of 4 hours double overtime to do this. And it's often unnecessary. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that those officers, and frankly, I don't mind if they make overtime. I don't mind if they make a lot of money. But if they're going to do it, they ought to be on the street doing community policing and patrolling, which prevents crime, as opposed to sitting downtown and never testifying or testifying unnecessarily. I can tell you, and I know that you're going to see the public defender later today, that she and I have also discussed this, and she is interested in an idea we have discussed, which is that in light of the many ways we're working together, rather than require an officer who's not essential, for example, an officer who merely handles a bag of drugs but doesn't really see what happens, rather than have that person come downtown and sit all day just to testify for less than 3 or 4 questions, we may be able to come to an agreement with the public defenders that for a preliminary hearing, they will agree to what that testimony would have been, thereby leaving that officer on the street in exchange for certain other things we can do.
And I think that, again, in light of the fact that there is a huge number to fill from the lack of forfeiture, enforcement, and others, I think this is the quick stuff we're going to need before the end of the budget to be able to justify the difference between your request and that of the mayor's.
Well, I can say this. I know that in the past, maybe 2008, there was a committee that worked on this issue. I know that they saved a few $1 million in that process. We've been encouraged to re-engage. We are very interested in re-engaging. I mean, simply our policies around what offers are given are reducing the number of trials and thereby potentially reducing the number of officers who are downtown instead of where they could be, which is on the street. So this is an issue that matters a lot to us. I mean, we are aware that a dollar invested in policing, meaning the presence of police, results in about $1.10 of benefit, but a dollar invested in corrections just gets you $1. It's a better way. We are all about preventing crime and everything that goes with it. And if that means having more police on the street, then we're completely in favor of that. We just have to figure out the ways to do it, and we have to figure out the ways to do it when there is an entrenched culture around financial benefit of having as many officers as possible coming downtown. So we're hopeful that everybody involved with this issue will be on board.
Yeah, no, it's a big one, and I know when, again, I'm in a high crime area, and absolutely want to advocate for additional police resources, but the fact of the matter is, between special events and protests and others, I'm always acutely aware that I have very few police officers actually on the street patrolling every single day because of how we deploy. So it's definitely a conversation, and to the extent that the DA's office is doing its part on that court piece, which is we've asked the police department to itemize separately, we can have that conversation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Allow me to read into the record Councilwoman Parker's question so that it is on the record. Specifically regarding the Economic Crimes Unit, she wishes to know what the department is doing to protect vulnerable people, in particular senior citizens who are being preyed upon, and she cites an example. Additionally, she would like some clarification on what cases are being handled by the DA's office around this topic and what cases are being handled specifically by the Attorney General's office. Lastly, she would like to see data regarding crimes prosecuted by this unit by councilmatic district. It would be useful for her to know where her district stands around this issue of economic crimes. Thank you, Mr. District Attorney, your entire team, very, very much.
Madam Chairwoman, thank you very much.
We will recess until 2:15 and encouraging all members to join us back here at 2:15 to continue with this afternoon's budget hearings. Thank you.